Hello, and welcome to Dig a Podcast, a show that tells the in-depth story behind the songs of the greatest band that is, was, and ever will be, the Beatles. In this season, Season 1, we will explore the Beatles' first LP, Introducing the Beatles, or our UK listeners would know it as Please Please Me. Introducing the Beatles was originally scheduled for a July 1963 release, but came out on the 10th of January 1964 on VJ Records, whereas Please Please Me was released on the 23rd of March 1963 on EMI's Parlophone label. Our next song is the title track of the UK LP
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Please Please Me. By the end of 1962, the Beatles were feeling rather frustrated and disillusioned. They had worked extremely hard during the previous 3 years to achieve national stardom, but were not able to penetrate any further than Liverpool and Hamburg. They began to feel stale and cramped, as John Lennon stated, and just wanted to get out of Liverpool and break new ground. Their appearance at the Cavern Club in Liverpool had become old hat to them. They had a tremendous following there, but it hadn't grown outside of their hometown. They were given brief appearances in other towns, such as Peterborough, opening up for Frank Ifield, but they always bombed when they were away from home. Lennon also felt that they had outlived the Hamburg stage, which they reluctantly went back to in November and December of 1962, only because of contractual obligation. They were even able to secure a professional recording contract with Parlophone Records, but their first single, Love Me Do, reached number 17 on the national charts, only because of local sales as well as their manager Brian Epstein personally purchasing 10,000 copies for his MEMS record store. But it seemed the Beatles were not to go any further than Liverpool. This is when a series of fortunate events, as well as a brilliantly written song, changed their fate as well as history itself. Little did they know that a song they recorded on November 26, 1962, which is intended for their second single, would be the one that would begin the chain of events to take them beyond their hometown and eventually to the whole world. The song that they recorded on that day was Please Please Me, which finally opened the doors that they had been knocking on for over 3 years. The first fortunate occurrence happened when Brian Epstein, as encouraged by George Martin, approached music publisher Dick James in order to secure a deal for publishing the new Beatles compositions. Brian was unpleased by the lack of effort Beechwood Music had put forward to promote Love Me Do. In order to get the publishing deal for the Beatles, Dick James played Please Please Me over the phone to Phil Jones, the producer of the national TV show Thank You Lucky Stars. Since Philip Jones agreed to book the Beatles on one of his shows, it clinched the deal for Dick James to be the Beatles' new music producer. The new single was released in Britain on January 11th, 1963. Since Britain was seeing one of the worst winters in history, most people were snowed in at home on January 12th to watch the Beatles perform Please Please Me on Thank You Lucky Stars. The national exposure of this exciting song, as well as the unusual appearance and hairstyle of the group, garnered the band a lot of attention and propelled the record up the national charts. And because of beginnings of success of the record, they were booked by promoter Arthur Howes on consecutive national tours. All of this gave the Beatles much press coverage, and combining all the ingredients, propelled their second single to number 1 on most of the British charts. And, as they say, the rest is history. Songwriting history. It has been agreed by both Lennon and McCartney that Please Please Me was entirely written by John. As recounted in his 1980 Playboy magazine interview, John Lennon states, "That's me completely. I remember the day I wrote it. I remember the pink eiderdown over the bed, sitting in one of the bedrooms in my house on Menlove Avenue, my auntie's place." The actual date of the writing can be pinpointed to June 7th and 8th of 1962, just after the Beatles returned from their first recording session at EMI Studios in London. Producer George Martin didn't think the 3 original compositions they recorded on that day, June 6th, were good enough to be used as their first single, so, spurred on to impress him, John immediately set out to write a song that was commercial enough. The perfect pop song. John continues, "It was my attempt at writing a Roy Orbison song, would you believe it? I heard Roy Orbison doing Only the Lonely on the radio. He set out to write a ballad in the dramatic, drawn-out style of Orbison, while incorporating a double use of the word please. This is the rendition of the song that was brought to EMI Studios on September 4th, 1962, for consideration for their first single. The song was to change shape, due to the suggestions of George Martin a week later." John then adds, "Also, I was always intrigued by the words of a Bing Crosby song that went, 'Please send a letter here to my please.' I was intrigued by the double use of the word please. So it was a combination of Roy Orbison and Bing Crosby." The song John refers to was the 1932 hit simply entitled Please, which spent 6 weeks at the top of the American charts that year. The following day, after the song was written by John, June 9th, 1962, the group played a Beatles Welcome Home show at the Cavern Club in Liverpool. After the performance, John and Paul, accompanied by young female fans Lindy Ness and Lou Stern, were driven over to Paul's home on Fourth Lane Road in Liverpool. "We spent the night there," Linda innocently wrote in her diary. This evening was noteworthy because, as detailed in Mark Lucian's book, Tune In, the song Please Please Me was still taking shape. Lewison writes, "Late night on June 9th, Lindy and Lou watched them refine Please Please Me, seated side by side at Jim Mack's upright piano in Paul's front parlour. Lindy recalls them mostly working on the chord changes, with a lot of joking and messing around. The 2 15-year-old girls stayed through the night and later dozed on the piano, while Lennon and McCartney explored chords above their heads. They asked us what they thought of it," Lou remembers, "and we said it was great. It was certainly great to see them writing, and that they didn't mind us being there, but they were always dead casual about things like that." This is not to say that Paul was to be viewed as a collaborator on this song. John made this point clear in a postcard he sent to Melody Maker magazine in 1971, saying, "I wrote Please Please Me alone. It was recorded in the exact sequence in which I wrote it. As mentioned above, Paul never claimed authorship of the song, referring to it as always John's." Recording history. Session 1. On September 4, 1962, the Beatles gathered in EMI Studio 2 for their first EMI recording session, trying to narrow down what would be the songs on their first single for the Parlophone label. Before the session began, producer George Martin and his assistant producer Ron Richards observed the Beatles going through a vigorous rehearsal session to determine which songs would be featured on their first record. George Martin had already determined that How Do You Do It, a Mitch Murray penned composition, had been handpicked for the Beatles to record, would be the A-side for their first single. The objective now was to pick which of their original songs would become the B-side. The Beatles rehearsed 6 songs in these 3 hours, 2:30 to 5:30 p.m, which included the newly written Please Please Me. As this was the slow and bluesy Roy Orbison version of the song, George Martin brought forth some suggestions. They played me Please Please Me, but it was very slow and rather dreary. George Martin relates in Mark Lewisohn's book Tune In, adding, I told them if they doubled the speed, it might be interesting. I told them what beginning and what ending to put on it. Paul remembers, we were a bit embarrassed that he had found a better tempo than we had. In any event, those suggestions were to be worked out and implemented by the group another time, thereby disqualifying Please Please Me for the B-side at this point. Of course, since it was a rehearsal session only, no tapes were rolling, so there is no audio evidence of this bluesy version of the song as John originally envisioned it. However, engineers Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich were present on this day to witness this early version of Please Please Me being rehearsed. In his book, Here, There and Everywhere, Jeff Emmerich explains, the song being rehearsed was soulful and was sung with great feeling by John, but had been a very slow tempo and was marred by a clumsy phrase that George Harrison played over and over again. Repetitive to the point of annoyance. Ringo was doing something odd too. He was sitting behind his kit with the maraca in one hand and a tambourine in the other, all while hitting the bass drum pedal with his right foot, a ridiculous posture that caused Norman Smith to burst into laughter and shout out to us, "Look at what that bloody drummer is up to now." George Martin, of course, witnessed this display as well, which could easily have cemented his earlier idea of using a studio drummer for the Beatles. As it turned out, Love Me Do was chosen by George Martin as the B-side for their new single at this point, then proceeding to record it later that day. The other rehearsed songs, including Please Please Me, were pushed back for possibly another time. Session 2. 1 week later, on September 11th, 1962, the Beatles reconvened at the EMI Studio 2 at 4:45 p.m. to continue the sessions for their first single. Because of disputes with publishing companies, the song How Do You Do It was no longer going to be part of the first Beatles single. George Martin reluctantly agreed that Love Me Do would be the A-side of the record, the objective of the session being to record songs for consideration for the B-side. Ron Richards was in the producer's chair, but George Martin decided to go ahead and hire a session musician to act as drummer on this day, his choice being Andy White. The first song recorded was P.S. I Love You, this being recorded relatively quickly, there being a good portion of studio time still available. Jeff Emmerich remembers, there was still another hour of time available to the Beatles. Have you boys got anything else you'd like to play for me? Ron Richards asked over the intercom. Yes, came the enthusiastic reply. Just then, George Martin walked in and got on the talkback to say hello to the band. He announced that he was going to have a quick listen to what they'd done, and would then be right down to start working on a new song. Norman Smith lifted a few faders, and we were able to hear what was going on downstairs. The Beatles had taken time in the past week to incorporate some changes that George Martin suggested for Please Please Me, including increasing the tempo, However, Ron Richards made another suggestion on this day. George was playing the opening phrase over and over and over throughout the song. I said, for Christ's sake, George, just play it in the gaps. Jeff Emerick continues. After the first run-through, there was a great deal of discussion, and it was clear that George Martin was dissatisfied. Look, you've definitely got something there, boys. We need to sort out some harmony parts for Paul. They nodded enthusiastically and began experimenting along with the lines that George had suggested. Lennon remembers that they were getting tired, but at least one of these tired experimentations were caught on tape. This version of Please Please Me was included on the 1994 compilation album Anthology 1. We almost abandoned it as a B-side of Love Me Do, John recalls. Imagine that, a number that could get us to the top just tucked away. We've been going over it a few times, and when it came to the question of the flip side of Love Me Do, we intended using Please Please Me, but our recording manager, George Martin, thought our arrangement was fussy, so he tried to make it simpler. We were getting very tired and just couldn't seem to get it right. An acetate disc of the recording done on this day is evidence that it was indeed in consideration for the B-side of Love Me Do. Interestingly, Jeff Emerick writes that drummer Andy White was dismissed for the day, just before they started work on Please Please Me. However, listening to the evidence on the Anthology 1 album, it appears that the drumming style is quite unlike that of Ringo. This newly found recording shows the drummer playing perfect drum fills in the bridge of the song, whereas Ringo's unusual staggered left-handed fills are prominently featured in the released version recorded in November. Mark Lewisohn's book, Tune In, verifies that Andy White was indeed the drummer on this version of the song. This then could be used as a pattern for Ringo to mimic during their next recording session. Ringo, of course, was present on this day, so could easily remember these intricate changes himself. After this first version of Please Please Me was recorded, they utilised the remaining time of the recording session to record another version of Love Me Do, with Andy White on the drums and Ringo on the tambourine. With this accomplished, the session ended at 6:30 p.m. We were standing in the corridor outside the control room after the session. Ron Richards remembers. George Martin was saying, we haven't quite got Please Please Me right, but it's too good of a song to just throw away. We'll leave it for another time. Listening to the Anthology 1 version, you can see just how close they really were to the finished version. Few missing ingredients could have easily have been added in overdubs, which was a luxury they did utilise anyway the next week. However, the decision was eventually made that the first version of Love Me Do, with Ringo on the drums, would be the A-side, and P.S. I Love You would be the B-side of their first single. In the meantime, the Beatles took to heart the suggestions made to rework Please Please Me, once again for a future recording session. Lennon states, in the following weeks, we went over it and over it again and again. Session 3. The next time the Beatles were in EMI Studio 2 was 2.5 months later, on November 26, 1962, to record their second single. And this time, no session drummer was in sight. George Martin acquisitioned to Ringo's rightful place behind the drum kit. 10 days earlier, however, on the 16th of November 1962, George Martin called a meeting with the group for a proposed plan of action. During this meeting, George Martin suggested resurrecting the Beatles' recording of How Do You Do It for the A-side of the second single, feeling strongly that it had hit potential. The group strongly objected, as he figured they would, therefore deciding their choice of Please Please Me would do the trick. George Martin's instincts were correct, Jerry and the Pacemakers cutting the song shortly thereafter and making it an international hit. It was decided, though, that the original session for Please Please Me, recorded on September 11th, was unsuitable for the Beatles' second record, so the November 26th session was arranged to remake the song, as well as to record the B-side. One 3-hour session was all that was thought to be needed, unlike the 2 3-hour sessions they were necessary for their first single. The band arrived in the studio at 6 p.m. for an hour-long rehearsal, with fan Roberta Bobby Brown present for moral support. In fact, during this rehearsal, Lennon suggested she play the piano during the quick ascending chords in each of the 3 verses of Please Please Me. In Mark Lewison's book Tune In, she relates, "John was showing me these chords on the piano, saying, 'So Bobby, you can play this.' And I just said to him, 'You're mad. There's no way I can do this.' He said, 'But you can play the piano.' And I said, 'Yes. But I have to have a piece of music in front of me.' It went on like this for some time, and in the end I just said, 'I can't do it.'" Not being a member of the Musicians' Union would have prevented her performance, not to mention that George Martin probably would have put the kibosh on it anyway. This rehearsal led straight into a proper 3-hour recording session that ran from 7 to 10 p.m. The Beatles launched right into the newly arranged Please Please Me at 7. It was suggested by Martin that Lennon play the harmonica for the main riff of the song rather than it being played on a guitar by George Harrison. But unlike the situation with Love Me Do, it was decided to record the song live with John playing guitar and overdub the harmonica afterwards. The result was a combination of Harrison on guitar and Lennon on harmonica, both doing that distinctive riff. The total number of takes, including the harmonica overdubs, amounted to 18. At around 9 p.m, after 2 hours of recording, George Martin made his famous exclamation from the recording booth, "You've just made your first number 1. This confidence on Martin's part continued from this point on, never again suggesting the Beatles to record other people's material for their singles, and this was maintained throughout their career. Although there were 8 US singles released that featured cover tunes as the A-side, these were decisions made by American record labels and not the official British releases. Mixing. Unlike the sessions for their first single, no mixes were made on this day. The rest of the 3-hour session consisted of recording 2 contenders for the B-side of the single, which were Ask Me Why and the ill-fated Tip of My Tongue, which never were released and is said to be lost. The Beatles gave the latter inferior song, George Martin's opinion, to another artist in Brian Epstein's stable, Tommy Quickly, who released it as the first single in August of 1963, although it didn't become a hit. The mono mix of Please Please Me was done 4 days later, on November 30th, 1962, in the control room of EMI Studio 2 by George Martin, Norman Smith, and an unnamed second engineer. It is not known which tape was used for this mix, but it was deemed suitable for the British single release on January 11th, 1963, as well as the mono version of the British album release on March 22nd, 1963. Curiously, when the Please Please Me album was being mixed for stereo on February 25th, 1963, in the control room of EMI Studio 1, Martin and his engineering staff, Smith, and A.B. Lincoln decided first to construct a new version of the song by editing takes 16, 17, and 18. From this, they then made a stereo mix of the song, which became the master for the stereo album in Britain as well as the US. There are some subtle but noticeable differences, such as Lennon's flubbering the line in the last verse. Instead of saying, "I know you never even try, girl," he starts out with the lyrics from the second verse by accident, which says, "Why do I always?" Lennon catches himself midway through the line and joins McCartney, who was harmonizing the correct line. This results in Lennon singing the next phrase, "Come on," with a slight laugh, knowing that he had made the mistake. Another noted difference in the stereo mix concerns the harmonica parts in the various parts of the song. The takes that George Martin used to form the stereo mix did not have the harmonica, since that was overdubbed afterwards. In order to edit in these harmonica pieces into the stereo mix, they actually had to sync up the finished mono mix with the stereo mix in those areas of the song. This resulted in an odd-sounding effect because the two separate takes of the song go in slightly different speeds. Especially noticeable in the final 10 seconds of the song, where the vocals don't match up very well. Nonetheless, this was deemed the best the EMI team could do, given that the master tape containing the harmonica overdubs no longer existed. Session 4. In order to be complete, mention should be made of a January 23rd, 1969 recording session at Apple Studios. The Beatles were rehearsing recording material for their latest project, Get Back, which became the album Let It Be, released on May 8th, 1970. This project was rehearsed in the studio while the tapes were rolling, which caught the band joking, arguing, and engaging in impromptu jam sessions. During an abortive attempt of the song I've Got a Feeling, the song segued into the first verse of Help, and then at the very beginnings of Please Please Me. Although this impromptu melody may pique our curiosity, it most likely will never be officially released because its rough and unprofessional quality. Incidentally, a film crew was in place for the majority of these sessions, as they were creating what was to become Let It Be movie. This medley was not used in the movie, but the footage has been leaked and surfaced in various places. Session 5. The Beatles also touched on Please Please Me at the very end of rehearsals on January 25th, 1969, which was also at Apple Studios, but this has never seen the light of day. Thanks for listening to Dig a Podcast. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. This has been a Team Wilgo production. Until next time, if you know what I mean. Do I did? No?